All right, 3x pitch analysis here. Awesome. Coming out of leg lift, you know, you're pretty stiff on your back leg. I like a little bend back there just because everything's trying to move forward, and that leg, if it doesn't have any bend in it, it has a hard time moving. And that femur right here has a hard time rotating, because that's what happens when you move forward. Your femur starts to rotate. So a little bend kind of helps that happen. Mm-hmm. You don't want to be too stiff. You don't have to be flex, but just a little bend. Coming out of leg lift, you do start to bend. See, before leg drive, see, not much of a load. I mean, you could be sitting way back here. So if I get the drawing tool, I'm gonna show you optimally where you want to go. You want to, like, as you keep moving forward, you probably want to get your hips to here, like that, ideally. You know, so that's would be you really getting into your backside. You're holding your knee out good, so you're not letting it collapse early. I even like how when you break your hands, you're pulling your elbow back. I'm always looking for, if I'm looking up here like this, if I get this drawing tool, guys who really separate well, as this lever is going this way, their femur and their knee is going that way, they counter it the opposite way. This will go that way. So you see how the little bend here is pushing this way, mm-hmm. The bend in the arm here is pushing the opposite way, and it creates that separation between the two. So I like how you're doing that. It's a good movement. I'd say you're just moving pretty slow, and I wonder if your hip abduction is locked up, so you might be leaning too far back. Do the drawing tool again. See, if your hip, so this is your hip flexing right here, mm-hmm. Okay? If it can't go much farther, the farther you lean against it into this angle, it reduces the amount of this angle, right? So if this was more upright, I could go more up with the femur, right? So we've got to be careful leaning too far back as we push the hips forward. As much as you want the hips to lead, if you just go too far, then you start over abducting your hip, or you get to the end of your hip and then you get stuck. And it could be where you are right now, and that's why your lift leg is now opening and reaching before you really get down and with your stride, or really get down with your hips through the stride. Because you can see at this point you're opening and rotating. So we're trying to get drive off the rubber, and if that femur or that tibia, which is the shin, if that's pointing straight up, I can't push. I'm just going to turn it over, mm-hmm. like a hitter. I'm just going to turn it over like that. There's a little push plate right here, but still not enough to drive your hips open. So if we look at the hip line, shoulder line, you can see there's some separation between the two, but we're going to see probably in the kinematic sequencing, the hip speeds are really not peaking well. Mm-hmm. And that's because your loading stopped here. We need, go back to the drawing tool. We need to keep those hips moving somewhere down here, and then your femur's here and more linear. So now when you push, it really accelerates your trunk that way. Okay. You're just getting to the point where you can't go anymore, probably because that hip can't flex anymore or abduct anymore, and you're opening and you're just turning over, so it's not giving us enough power through the hip. So let's look at what kind of speed's coming through the hip. This is called our kinematic sequencing, so it's the energy moving through your body and showing us when the timing's going off. So the red is your hip. Mm-hmm. So your hip is leading, which is great, which you want. And I love how your glove is not pulling with it. That's a huge plus. So you have a really good kinematic sequence. You're going hip, glove, trunk. Ideally, I'd like glove, trunk a little closer together. Trunk is the green. And but at the end of the day, it's really not that much separation. So what gets this hip to come up a little earlier and the trunk a little later, which is what high velocity pitchers do, it's just the power through that hip. So if you can keep loading and get more power, boom, it punches that hip through, and then that hip peaks over here, and that trunk will even pull away farther here, and then you get more of that separation, hip, trunk, as opposed to hip, trunk. If we get more separation, it's going to be a lot more energy coming up the chain. But I like your timing, but it's the lack of dynamics. You already done?
IMG? Not yet.
Oh, you got IMG, sure. So at this point, if you had more separation and you had more energy through those movements, you'd be in a lot more forward trunk position. You can see at release your trunk is really upright. So I like to see it in a linear sequence. So you can see, so this is how everything's rotating, and then the linear kinematic sequence is how everything's going forward, like dominoes. And they're the same color for the lines. So the red is the hip, the blue is the glove, the green is the trunk, the yellow is the arm. You can see here, your hips are peaking about right here, a little bit after where the angular was peaking, and then the trunk is peaking earlier, linear, which means it's going to die off faster. So you can see when your trunk opens up, your linear energy is way more shut off than your angular energy. So you got more of this, you don't have a lot of that. Mm-hmm. And that's because in your initial movement, your hip stopped and you opened and rotated, so you didn't build all that linear power through your stride, which when your trunk separates, pushes all through your trunk. And we get all these good forward trunk tilts. So if we look right here at pitch release, which would probably be right there, your chest is actually still back. This is forward. So that's crazy. So your trunk at pitch release is still back like this. And a high velocity pitcher is going to be 45 on the forward side. So they're going to be 45 forward at pitch release. You're back 11 degrees. So there's no linear force, which is huge. I mean, that's an easy 10, 15 miles an hour. So that's when you know, oh, okay, when I can get the momentum off the rubber, when I can transfer that forward through the trunk, that's a huge jump in velocity for me. So, I mean, that's a plus, is when you see, man, I'm around 80 and I don't even move my trunk forward. And that study shows the biggest predictor of velocity. So what happens when I move my trunk forward? You're 90 plus at that point. As far as at pitch release in what's called contralateral, you're not even contralateral. So you're spinning, but because your glove wasn't pulling aggressively, you're not like aggressively flying off. So it's not like you're not a guy where people are going to go pulling too hard, or you're flying off, or you're flying open. You're just a guy who doesn't have enough energy moving down the mound that we really need to build. And then you can see your front leg could drive too. Your front leg could kick back. So you can get the linear power from the back leg push, and then you can get the kick back, a front leg drive that pushes more linear power, which you're not using either one. You're just turning over and just rotating around. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.